Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon to a special panel at the Battle of Ideas hosted by the Free Speech Union. So, the title of this panel is Online Censorship, an International Clampdown. And it was partly inspired by a meeting that took place just around the corner from here a few weeks ago. It was convened by Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger. And we all met the following day upstairs at Unheard to talk about what we could do to combat what Michael and Matt call the censorship industrial complex, what is seemingly a very well-funded international multi-agency effort to suppress what these agencies call misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and hate speech. And one of the things we discussed at this meeting at Unheard was, to what extent is this international effort organic, and to what extent is it coordinated? And if it's coordinated, who's it being coordinated by? And why are all these governments and quasi-governmental agencies and former intelligence officers and think tanks and NGOs and government departments like the DCMS, why are they engaging in this energetic, very well-funded effort to suppress speech, primarily online, but not exclusively online, when all the evidence suggests that it doesn't work? At least that's my view. You may disagree with me, but I think there's something like the Barbara Streisand effect at play. A good example is the attempt to suppress any discussion about the safety and efficacy of the COVID vaccines. That was heresy. We know from Silky's work at Big Brother Watch that many people tweeting their reservations about the safety and efficacy of the COVID vaccines, as well as speculating about the origins of the virus, they were some of the most likely posts on social media to be flagged to the social media companies by various shadowy agencies in Whitehall. They were very anxious because I think they somehow thought that if people were allowed to discuss this openly online and it wasn't suppressed, that would increase vaccine hesitancy. People then wouldn't get vaccinated. They'd be more likely to get COVID. The pandemic would last longer. But in fact, it had the opposite effect, and that was entirely predictable. It increased, it didn't reduce vaccine hesitancy. It made people suspicious. It increased vaccine hesitancy. Not only did people become more hesitant about taking the COVID vaccines, but they also became more hesitant about taking the MMR, which is why we've had measles outbreaks in some of the major cities in the world since 2021, New York, London, amongst other examples. Another example, the steal. This was one of the most heretical things you could possibly say on social media, even Twitter in the pre-Elon Musk era. If you speculated about the possibility that electoral fraud had played a part in the US presidential election result in 2020, you could be your post would be immediately removed. You could end up being banned from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. It was one of the most heretical, seditious, unacceptable pieces of misinformation you could disseminate on social media. Yet a year later, all the survey evidence suggests, a year after they began to ban it, shortly after January 6th, 2021, a year later, more Americans believe this deal was true than fewer. It doesn't work. There's a Barbara Streisand effect. So why are they bothering to do it? So that's one of my big questions. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to our panel. We have a fantastic panel here. Three of the panelists were signatories of the Westminster Declaration, this declaration which came out of this meeting after the event and the meeting at Unheard. Some of you have read it, I imagine. It's easy to find. It was published a couple of weeks ago, and I think it is gathering a bit of momentum, has had a bit of an impact. Three of us on this panel, and I think the only reason we didn't ask you to sign it, Norman, was just an oversight, because I think you weren't at the original meeting. But anyway, we're going to start with Dr. Norman Lewis, who's a visiting research fellow at MCC Brussels, co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. Then we're going to come to Silky Carlo, director of Big Brother Watch and the co-author of Information Security for Journalists. Then to my right, Thomas Farsi, journalist and writer, author of The Battle for Europe, How an Elite Hijacked a Continent and How We Can Take It Back, and The COVID Consensus, The Global Assault on Democracy and the Poor, a critique from the left. You've probably read Thomas in Unheard and elsewhere. And finally, on my far right, Konstantin Kisin, purely coincidental.
Where I belong. He just wanted to make
satirist, podcaster, trigonometry, convener, author of An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. So we're going to speak, they're going to speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to throw it open to you. And we've got until about 4:15 when we have to stop sharpish, and there'll be some closing remarks just before then. So Norman, over to you first.
Thank you, Toby. Good afternoon. I don't think in the 50 years that I've been involved in politics that there's been a more important time to defend free speech than now, even for the defenders of Hamas. It's something I just want to get that on the table, because I think this is a really fundamental conversation that we're having, and there's a lot at stake. What I'm going to try to do in 5 minutes, which is almost impossible, is try and explain why this clampdown is happening. I think the fact that it is happening is not something that we need to really spend a lot of time on. There's so much evidence to show that there is a global clampdown on free speech, online in particular. But what I really think we need to try and unpick is, why is this happening? What is really driving this? It's very, very important for us to understand this. There's two things I want to look at as briefly as I can, because I'm doing research in Brussels. I want to look at the EU in particular, because I think the EU are very much at the forefront of this dynamic, and I'll explain why. And secondly, I want to try and explain that what's driving the EU, which is similar to other elites around the world, is a crisis of authority. And that's really what underpins the dynamic and what makes it so intractable. The point about the EU, and to put it briefly, the EU's got a real big problem when it comes to technology, and digital technology in particular. The problem they've got is that Europe is not a player in digital technology. Big tech is all extraneous. It's all American, or it's Chinese, or whatever. They don't have their own technology with which to participate or compete in the global arena. What they do have is access to the single market. And access to the single market gives them a huge amount of power over regulating what big tech can do. And so what you have in Europe, in EU, is a dynamic which is centered around the regulation of other people's technology as a way where through the EU can play its role in the global geopolitics of technological sovereignty, the fragmentation of the world economy, etc., all of these things that are beyond their control. And so there's a real desire on their part to assert what we would call their digital sovereignty, which is not based on technological sovereignty. And so it's in the realm of regulation that you find the EU is so interventionist. I'll just give you one statistic just to explain what I mean by this. Since the US was founded, 234 years, they have passed 30,000 statutes. 30,000. The EU, since 66, since the Treaty of Rome, has passed over 100,000. If you took that statistic and you converted it into America, we would have something like 354,000 pieces of statute in America. The proliferation of rulemaking in the EU is just phenomenal. And if anybody's ever been to Brussels, I mean, you can't move without there being a regulation on everything you do. Well, what really underpins that, besides their need to try and curb the power of big tech or whatever, is a real crisis of their authority. And I think this is really an important point for us to, perhaps other people will have different perspectives on this, but I think this really begins to explain the dynamic. And the crisis that they have is that they have a real legitimacy crisis, because you have the EU Commission, which is not elected, which is a self-appointed body. It is not accountable to anyone. It's not. It has all the power resides within the Commission, where it can pass legislation, it can initiate legislation, and then get a rubber stamp through the European Parliament, which has no power whatsoever. And what they are concerned about is they have power, but they can't really exercise it other than through passing laws. So they're very good at rulemaking, but there's no organic connection between them and the people of Europe. And so what they're constantly doing is that they have to justify themselves through what Hannah Arendt referred to as negative authority. They can't justify themselves in terms of their own values, because their values, which are completely removed from the people of Europe, is not based on democracy. In fact, it's based on exactly the opposite. Means that they have to, the only way they can endow their power with any meaning is to justify their position by highlighting the intellectual and moral deficits of the people, of ordinary people in the public, which is precisely why they are so fixated on controlling the narrative in Europe, controlling what can and what cannot be said online, precisely because they themselves are suffering from a crisis of values, where they are constantly on the search for finding some kind of connection with the people of Europe, but who therefore are attracted to ideologies and ideas that in fact fragment society rather than unite it. So the whole woke agenda, for example, which is very, very strong in Europe, you will see this everywhere, means that instead of this resulting in all these rules creating some forms of unity in Europe, it actually becomes divisive. And increasingly, it means that the quest to find that legitimacy is always beyond them. And so they're constantly looking for new areas through which they can do this, through rulemaking, etc. So I think why this is important to understand is because if you can only rule through negative authority, then the only thing that you've got left in your arsenal is the ability to try and control what is thought and what is said. What is, that becomes the critical question. And this is, for me, the most important question that I think we need to answer in this discussion today. But who decides what can and cannot be said online? They've decided that they have the right, which is what the Digital Services Act is really all about. It's about the content regulation. And just final point, just to understand how this works. The way the EU operates is they pass a law called the Digital Services Act, which basically says that the big platforms now, if misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech is flagged up to them, they have to remove it immediately. Otherwise, they face draconian fines, etc. What they do is they pass this law, and then it becomes the rule of law. And so what they do is when the censorship takes place, which is already we've seen with relation to what's happened in Israel, where they've already put in notices to X and to Facebook to take down disinformation on Palestine. What we see happening is
Not to the BBC.
Well, the BBC, the Hamas Broadcasting Corporation. Yeah. They then, what they do is they say, well, it's not us censoring, it's big tech, because big tech's going to take this down. And so big tech says, well, it's not us, we are just following the law. And so there's this censorious roundabout takes place with no accountability to anybody. And all that happens in those circumstances is that speech gets dictated. Free speech no longer exists online when you have this kind of a regime. And they are insulated from any accountability for this. The problem for them is that this doesn't legitimize their rule whatsoever. All it does is it brings into question the whole time about who made them, who gave them the right to decide what can and cannot be said in these circumstances. And so it backfires in that sense, not in the sense that I think Toby's talking about, but I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, which only leads to more and more need for draconian clampdown. That's what's behind the censoriousness. That's what's behind, and this is happening not just in Europe, it's happening in the UK. I mean, look at the Online Safety Bill. It's even worse than the Digital Services Act. Who would have thought that? You look what's happening in Canada. Look what's happening in Australia. It's all the same trajectory, precisely because the elites in all of these countries suffer from the same legitimacy crisis. And that's what I think we need to understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sophie.
Thank you. Well, I'm Silky Carlo. I'm the director of Big Brother Watch. We're a privacy and civil liberties campaign group in the UK. And I joined in 2018. And since then, we have seen a consistent assault on the right to freedom of expression, particularly online. And I think there is a spectrum from the elements of this that are genuinely an assault on free speech, all the way to a derision of free speech, misunderstanding of what free speech is, complacency about free speech. I think there's a whole spectrum of a lack of respect for free speech that have gotten us into the situation that we're now in. I will talk a little bit about the Online Safety Bill now Act, actually, as of yesterday, in the UK. And note that there have been very similar acts in Australia, Canada, Germany, EU, across the Five Eyes, which is not irrelevant. But I'm actually not really going to speak much about why, because my main interest is what we're going to do about it. But with each of these pieces of legislation, they of course have an international impact as well. So you can't really just talk about um, attacks on free speech in a domestic. I mean, we can think about it in a domestic setting, but we have to recognise that this is now a truly international problem. The second thing I want to say is that pushback can work. Um, can you put your hands up if you either signed a petition about censorship in the Online Safety Bill or wrote to your MP? Amazing. So we're in a room of people that have taken action on this, and well done, because we won against the worst aspects in the Online Safety Bill. There was supposed to be this power whereby the platforms had to censor legal but harmful speech, which is gone. And that's a huge victory. And thanks to every single person that took action and the many groups that worked on that, because it was totally unexpected, I have to say. That was really at the heart of the legislation. But problems do still remain in the now Act. We've done a blog on the top 5 things that you need to know that have changed under the Online Safety Act. I've just tweeted it. If you want to have a look, I'm at Silky Carlo, but I'm going to tell you the top 3 very, very quickly. One is that the social media companies are now effectively judge and jury over speech. So for all of the talk that there is about unlawful content online, and all of the government's press about the bill was about stuff that's unlawful, child sex abuse, terrorism, really nasty stuff, there actually isn't anything in the bill, anything in the Act that is about linking up with law enforcement. It's about the tech companies having to basically be like privatized police and not really. Therefore, there's no justice, there's no real punishment. There's just a kind of brushing nasty stuff under the carpet and deleting stuff. And of course, when you're adjudicating on speech, there are very, very nuanced issues. You know, what counts as malicious communications, hateful speech? The companies will now err on the side of caution like never before, because they've got these huge threats over them. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second is exactly what was just outlined about this odd relationship between the state and the big tech companies with regards to terms of service. Terms of service are almost now like speech laws, because the Online Safety Act says to the companies, you must consistently enforce your terms of service. If under terms of service, you can't say something like men aren't women, or if under terms of service, you can't post the whereabouts of Elon Musk's private jet when he doesn't like it, that now it's a state duty. It's a legal duty that they have to enforce what those terms of service are on the day. It's absolutely bonkers. From a human rights point of view, it makes no sense. It means that the state has basically surrendered its obligation that it has to all of us, thanks to the Human Rights Act, that the state has to protect our free speech. We've done away with decades of case law, and value building about free speech and just said, we're going to hand it over to some foreign companies who have absolutely no interest in your right to free speech. It's truly mad. And the third thing is age gating. So unfortunately, legal but harmful as a concept, mad. I mean, like the phrase is Orwellian. As a concept, still exists for children. So for companies that aren't checking the age of their users, they will try to create like a kind of nursery playground experience for you. Like they have to make it child friendly. We're going to see a lot of changes, I think, over the years to come. The other thing I want to say is we have to now, when we're thinking about what are we going to do about this, we should probably be preparing for a Labour government and thinking about how these powers will be used under a Labour government. And that brings me to the final point very quickly, is that counter disinformation really is a new frontier for free speech. We have spoken to each other a lot on this panel about these issues. And the way in which, I kind of see this in the same way that in the counter-terror years, we saw a trickle down, didn't we? You had a raft of powers about counterterrorism. Then it was counter-extremism, which never had a definition. To this day, it doesn't really have a definition. And now we've got counter-disinformation. And we're seeing actually some of the same people affected, but it has a truly cross-party impact. Disinformation is a real issue. In an age of AI, it will be a growing issue. But the terminology is being abused to serve the interests of people with power rather than the public. If you're in any doubt about that, please have a look at our work. We put out a report at the beginning of this year called Ministry of Truth, and we've got a campaign page called minitruth.co.uk, where we found that anyone from members of parliament to world-leading academics, human rights campaigners, and broadcasters, commentators, are being put into disinformation reports by our government secretly for things that they have said that are A, accurate, B, lawful, where there's not a hint of disinformation. We found that even the British Army was involved in doing this. We've got some more news coming out about this in coming days, but one piece of news that we had out yesterday is that the journalist Julia Hartley-Brewer was included. We knew already she was included in one of these reports, but specifically, just to give you a flavour of what this can look like, she'd been included in one of these reports and termed as, because she had criticised a policy to do with potentially losing face-to-face teaching during the pandemic if not enough children were vaccinated. She had criticised this policy. They included her in a secret counter-disinformation report and kind of dismissed her as a known vaccine skeptic. Julia had spoken about vaccine benefits extensively on her show. It was a lie. She's not a vaccine skeptic. We took legal action for her, and the government came back and apologised to her and said and acknowledged it was unlawful, it was inaccurate, and it was not impartial. But the other thing that they told us is that not only had they written this in the secret report, they sent it to 64 people across the UK government and to the US government, to an interagency unit designed to fight terrorism and propaganda coming out of Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. That's how serious the threat is. This unit is still operational. Big Brother Watch's intention is to shut it down. So if you're interested in that, then please support us. I'm sure we'll talk about it more.
I'm just going to briefly take advantage of my role as chairman to make a couple of comments before going on to Thomas. One thing I think we should be aware of is that even though, thanks to the efforts of Big Brother Watch and others, all references, I think, to misinformation and disinformation in the Online Safety Act were stripped out during the parliamentary process. And that took a great deal of effort. One of the things that was initially in the bill in the legal but harmful clause is that social media companies would be obliged to remove health-related misinformation and disinformation. That's now gone. But under the Digital Services Act, any social media company operating under license in the EU has to include within its terms and conditions that it will remove misinformation and disinformation. And my worry is that companies like Facebook, when they won't differentiate in their T's and C's between what's allowed in the EU and what's allowed in the UK. They'll just have a Europe-wide T's and C's, which means that in spite of all our efforts to get all references to misinformation and disinformation removed from the Online Safety Act, they'll be put into, if they're not there already, the terms of service of all these big social media companies just to comply with the Digital Services Act. One other point, you said disinformation is a real problem, and I think it is a real problem and may become a bigger problem because of AI. It's a problem in the sense that it exists. There are bad actors, in some cases state actors, deliberately disseminating it, often with a view to influencing election results in liberal democracies. But it's not such a big problem in that that's effective. I mean, there isn't much research evidence that people's choices at the ballot box during elections are influenced by disinformation. It turns out ordinary people are quite good at differentiating between stuff which is obviously false and misleading and which isn't, and discerning the motives of those disseminating it on social media platforms. The people who oddly seem really susceptible to disinformation are educated elites. And I guess just one example was the willingness of the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the LA Times, etc., to regurgitate what was obviously disinformation, perhaps not so obviously at the time, but which we now know was disinformation disseminated by the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which is a Hamas-controlled ministry. They seem particularly susceptible to it, but ordinary people on the whole don't seem to be. And there doesn't seem to be an infodemic in that respect. There seems to be another reason why the UN, the WHO, all these governments across the world, DCMS, the BBC, why they are so preoccupied with trying to cleanse online media from misinformation and disinformation.
Just very quickly. I mean, it's a new term that gives reach to new power, but it's an old issue. I mean, disinformation is another word for lies. It's another word for propaganda. So the way in which we see it will be new with AI, but it's an ancient issue.
Yes, yeah, but there's no reason to think it's the number one issue facing democracy and causing an existential crisis. And if we don't solve it, we'll all go to hell.
Yeah.
Thomas.
Thank you, Toby. Well, I've just had a first-hand experience with online censorship, which I think is quite paradigmatic of just how perverse online censorship really can be. So I wanted to talk about that a bit. So on Tuesday, I published a thread on X, formerly Twitter, based on an article, my latest article published on Unheard, which wasn't really that controversial. It was a history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And yes, I did challenge some myths from my perspective about the process, namely the fact that Palestinians are almost entirely to blame for the failure of the peace process. But really, I wasn't making any claims that, countless Israeli historians haven't made before me. So, I wasn't expecting much to happen from that. But immediately after I published the thread, I started getting replies under the thread from people saying that they couldn't view the thread. All they could see was the first post. And then all the subsequent tweets were marked as this post is unavailable. And then I had people tell me that if they shared the tweet on their profile, it wouldn't come up on their profile. They'd go and check their profile. It wouldn't be there. As I started to reply to comments under the thread, and no one answered me, I realized that they weren't getting notified for my replies. So no one knew that I was actually replying to them. And by the way, all throughout this, I could view the thread just fine. But I had people, and interestingly, it wasn't 100% of users, like 98%. Some people could see the thread, but 98% of users, they all posted a screenshot of the thread, and it was the same for almost everyone. And so I realized quite soon that I was probably, or I had been, shadow banned. although some might disagree with that term. There's disagreements about what shadow banning actually is. But if you're not familiar with the world of online censorship, briefly, it's a particularly Kafka-esque form of censorship where users' content will be limited in several ways. So that might be not showing it to that many users, hiding it from the search results, or censoring threads and replies outright. And the worst part, apart from more overt forms of censorship, such as blotting out an entire thread. So I might, of course, I'm going to know about it, even if I can see it just fine, because people are going to tell me about it. But in most cases, it's not apparent to the user that they're being censored. Often the only way of knowing that this is happening or that there's something wrong is that you notice a sudden drop in interactions, in the number of views, for example. But precisely because the whole point of shadow banning is that it's not officially happening, and it can also be quite hard to prove sometimes, it also means there's no way of appealing that decision. In fact, the first thing I did when I realized what was happening, I wrote to X support. And at this point, I was still thinking that maybe it was just a glitch, a bug. But they got back to me quite soon, saying it was an automated response, but it said, sometimes we will take action on an account or a post based on behavior that creates a negative impact on X, whatever that means. But it seemed to imply that the decision was deliberate. And interestingly, they also specified in that same email that there was no further action I could take. And this is also interesting. So when a censorship is overt, such as when your account is blocked, for example, there are formal appeal processes that you can follow. Even X has a formal appeal process that you can follow if your account has been blocked. But there's no appeal process for accounts that have only been limited. And that is just one of the many ways which makes this form of censorship particularly Kafkaesque, as I said. And I think it's interesting to note that Twitter, for a long time, denied that shadow banning even existed, that it even occurred on Twitter. It was only when Elon Musk took Twitter over and started releasing internal documents through the Twitter files that it became apparent that not only did shadow banning exist, but that it had been massively used, especially since 2020, to deboost or de-amplify content that didn't chime with official narratives, especially on COVID, but not only, as Toby said. Now, Musk immediately vowed to put an end to shadow banning. So this was a year ago when he closed the deal for Twitter. But he has recently said that it's proving much harder than he expected. He said, as recently as in July, that shadow banning is buried so deep in the Twitter code that shadow bans are often triggered automatically by the algorithm. And it often, this is a quote, it often takes us hours to figure out who, how, or why an account was suspended or shadow banned. This is Elon Musk in July. So here we have richest man in the world who presumably has access to the best programmers in the world, who, if we want to believe what he's saying, is saying that a year after taking on Twitter, he hasn't been able to figure out, to crack the code, which under which the shadow banning algorithm works. So, if you're getting vibes of Skynet, I think you would be justified. So what was going on? Was I just a victim of an out of control algorithm that had that works in mysterious ways and had shadow banned me? Maybe because the number of users had reported my post because they didn't like it. It's a possibility. Or was it a deliberate political decision? After all, we do know that pro-Palestinian content has been censored since the start of Israel's operation in Gaza, mostly on Meta. There's been a lot of cases on Instagram, some complaints about X as well, but not as many. And I think this should be concerning even for those who disagree with those opinions. But again, if the decision was political, so someone made the decision to take that content down, who's making that decision? We don't know. Is it the company itself? Is it X? Is it X acting under pressure from advertisers, from governments, from fact checkers, from other institutions, from the EU? There's no way of knowing. Or maybe it was really a glitch. It was really a bug. And in fact, a lot of companies, Meta, is blaming all these alleged shadow bans on bugs. They say, no, we haven't shadow banned anyone. It's just, it's the code acting up. It's the algorithm going a bit crazy. We're not doing any censorship. This has been Meta's official reply to hundreds of users saying that they had noticed that their content was being shadow banned, mostly on Instagram. But the problem is there's really no way of knowing. And in fact, in a final plot twist, my account, the thread was then de-shadow banned yesterday, I think. And again, I don't know why. So I don't know why it was shadow banned in the first place. Don't know why it was de-shadow banned. Is it because I kicked up a bit of a shitstorm on X, which went viral? Is it because I made a few calls with some friends I have at X? I honestly don't know. And that's the crazy part. That's really the fundamental crux of the problem, I think. Old school censorship was, of course, bad enough, but at least it was quite explicit. Generally, you knew who was censoring you and why, whether it was the government or other institutions, private institutions. But now I think we've entered a much more perverse form of kind of postmodern censorship, where you don't even know really who is censoring you, if they're really censoring you, if they are, why they're censoring you. And in fact, you're often, as a lot of users, as it is happening to a lot of users at the moment, you're often gaslit into thinking it's not even really happening. You're just imagining it. And I think this is really truly dystopian. And I think, as a society, we really need to get a grip on it before it's too late. Thank you.
Sorry, Constantine.
A few things I wanted to pick up on that have already been said, and a very good set of ideas has been communicated already. I think one of the things that's missing from our conversation so far is that in order to win the argument over free speech, we're going to have to be honest about where the desire to restrict it is coming from, and we haven't actually identified it so far, I think. So I'll try to do that in the next few minutes. Where are we on free speech? Well, I think there are good news and bad news. I think the good news, for example, are despite the fact that the Free Speech Union is not a big organization because not enough of you have joined it, and likewise Big Brother Watch and small new media organizations like mine are very small. Actually, I think the impact that we have managed to have has been quite disproportionately positive. And I think we should take a moment to actually acknowledge that. One person, good. One person reluctantly clapping. I think the other good news, setting aside the aberration that Thomas just told you about, I think the fact that Elon Musk took over Twitter is actually a very positive change, because one of the things that was happening prior to this was that all the social media companies were colluding together to restrict the same type of speech from the same type of people. We no longer have that, which means that as the Overton window, the window of things that we're allowed to discuss on social media, has been opened up. And it's interesting to me that you had that shadow banning experience, because there is no shortage of racist, anti-Semitic memes and comments on Twitter, which I'm very comfortable with, by the way. I've said this from day one. It was always going to happen as restrictions were removed. I'm very happy blocking people who send me, anti-Semitic tweets or whatever. It's not a problem. I think that is the price we pay, and this is something I'm going to come on to in a second. But the fact that there is now a social media platform on which you can post things that you could not elsewhere, and that will not censor certain types of speech and certain types of information, is, for example, one of the reasons that the BBC is now calling Hamas terrorists, because the social media ability to kick up a storm about things like that is why the media, the legacy media, are forced to change their narrative and are forced to change the way that they communicate about certain things. So that's the good news. The bad news is I think we've heard some misunderstandings of where the desire for censorship comes from. Is we think that the reason that free speech is being censored is that there are evil authoritarians out there who want to suppress our views as citizens. There may be some, I don't think many in the West. There's certainly people outside the West with that worldview. I actually think in the West it is much, much worse than that, for reasons that I'll explain. I think that those of us who, I'm 40, most of you in the room I think are my age or older, we all remember the days of the wild, wild days of the internet where there were none of these concerns. People were free to say whatever the hell they wanted. The thing that we have to acknowledge is that the internet, particularly with social media, is an incredibly powerful technology. And when firearms were invented, it was perfectly normal for private citizens to be allowed to own pistols and handguns and all sorts of other weapons. There are very few countries in the world that allow people to own grenade launchers. There are no countries in the world that allow people to own nuclear weapons, individual people. And the internet now is much closer to a nuclear weapon than it is to a pistol, in the sense that if I can start a riot from my phone, you can see why that would be a concern. And one of the things that has happened as a result of this is our moral norms have changed because we now see the real world consequences of things that are perhaps started or initiated on the internet. We now treat speech completely differently as a result. So, for example, if I can start a riot on the internet, the result of which is videos on the internet of people being physically assaulted, we're going to react differently to that, to the way that we might have in the past. The example I always give to Americans who support restriction of speech is I'm like, the American Revolution actually would not have happened if we had the censorship regime in place that we do today. That was driven primarily by the printing press, by pamphleteering and so on. If there was censorship then, the American Revolution never would have happened. But where we are at the moment, and I'll give you an example. I apologize to the people who were at my earlier session because I'll repeat a story that I told there. The last time I did Question Time, most people don't know, but when they publish Question Time, they don't release the full program. The first question is a warm-up question that they don't publish. And on that occasion, the question that they didn't publish was Donald Trump had just been unbanned from Facebook on that day, and they asked everybody on the panel what they thought about it. I made the point, which I thought was rather uncontroversial, that the leader of the most powerful country in the world should be allowed to speak in public. To a muted response, less, even more muted than that one. Fiona Bruce went around the panel before eventually getting to the Labour representative on the panel, who, without a second's hesitation, said, "We must have the safest internet in the world." To which I thought, what, safer than North Korea? And the point that I'm making is these people don't understand. We no longer understand in our public debate that there are trade-offs between freedom and safety. And so when people talk about the need for a safe internet, they're simply forgetting that that comes at the price of our freedom of expression, because we have stopped having that argument because we keep pretending these are tyrannical authoritarians. Actually, they're not. And the reason I say it is worse is the famous C.S. Lewis quote on this topic, which is that the tyranny exercised for the benefit of its victims is the most oppressive. He said it would be much better to be ruled by robber barons because at least their cruelty may sleep. But those who torment us for our own good do so forever because they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And we are going to have to win the argument on those terms. The people who claim that restrictions of our freedoms are necessary for our safety are correct. You do get more safety by removing freedom. The argument is about where the line between our freedoms and our safety should be. And so I think the fundamental battle here actually is to win the argument over the fact that we prefer freedom and less safety over the other way around. And until we're willing to confront that, we're never going to win. This is why I said earlier that I'm very comfortable with racist or anti-Semitic speech on X, because it is a natural consequence of the lifting of restrictions. And until we start being honest about that, I'm afraid we're going to be fighting a rearguard action all the way. Thank you.
So just before we come out to all of you, I want to ask Constantine a follow-up question.
Mm.
I think there's certainly a lot in that. One of the reasons free speech is under assault is because politicians, senior bureaucrats, professional elites, the international media, particularly the legacy media, are beginning to value safety more highly and freedom less highly. And certainly we saw that during the pandemic. We see it over the debates about climate change too. There was a call last week for climate denialism to be criminalized, that it supposedly is endangering all of our safety. But one reason for this, Constantine, might be, not saying it is, but it could be, the greater number of women in public life. Statistically, women on average are likely to value safety more highly than men and freedom less highly than men. That's a kind of key biological difference. You may disagree with that. But
I'll bide my time, Toby.
good. Okay, you can come back before we go out to the floor. But
Silky looks delighted.
But Constantine, just supposing that one of the reasons that the dials have shifted, that the scales have moved slightly, is not entirely because of the entrance of women into public life, but in part that's a contributory factor. What can we do about that? I mean, it's not obvious what could possibly be done. Isn't it just a trade-off of having a more gender equal society?
Well,
Have
Thank
more
you.
men identify as women? That could be one solution.
Thank you for that hospital pass, Toby. I appreciate it. It's actually going to make what I was going to say much more controversial. I actually didn't intend what I'm about to say in that way. But those of you who've read my book will know that, this is about the pussification of the West. I don't mean it in the greater... This is your fault, mate, not mine. Because I don't mean that there are more women now in public roles and that's what's happening. I just mean that as a culture, we have become much more safetyist, much more focused on that, much less willing to encounter discomfort, encounter pain, encounter ideas we don't like, encounter people being racist. I mean, look, when I went to school and somebody called me a Paki and I came home to my parents and told them that, they didn't tell me to go and complain. They said, there are some idiots in society. It's your job to get used to that fact. It's going to happen. Ignore it and get on with your day, right? Nobody ever in public says that to anybody anymore. Anytime anyone brings up any claim of racism of any kind, we all act like Hiroshima just happened. It didn't. It's just some words. Get on with it, right? But nobody's... So whether that is caused by women voting, I'll leave to you, Toby. But my point is, I think our culture has shifted into a much more safety-orientated society, and that is what we need to change. How we change that, I think, is a very, very different and difficult conversation.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking it was the consequence of granting women the vote.
Although that should be,
that
should be rescinded.
I was thinking more as we get more and more female political leaders, senior female bureaucrats, women running public institutions, media companies, some of their seemingly underlying preference for safety over liberty, which rhymes with their maternal instincts. We saw this with thinking of
free speech.
Has
Remember?
anyone got a shovel for
Free
Toby?
speech.
Jacinda Ardern, Nicholas Sturgeon. Anyway, go ahead, Silky.
I genuinely don't know where to start.
I didn't think this was particularly controversial.
Well, I'm glad then that you're here to have a platform to say it so we can all explain why it is controversial and also wrong. First of all, I think the distinction between this distinction between freedom and safety, I think it needs to be isn't actually straightforward. I mean, I don't actually believe that censorship and intrusion into your personal sphere necessarily makes you safer at all. It only makes you safer if you believe that the people with power are there to keep you safe. you know, you gave the example of North Korea. Are the North Koreans safe? No, they're not at
There's
all.
less crime in the streets of North Korea, I can tell you. There is.
But of course the population is deeply unsafe and victimized by the people with power. Likewise, you know, if the police have the ability to come into your home whenever they want to, and we have this debate with surveillance a lot, you know, if you had a camera in everyone's bedroom, would it be a safer world? Who's watching the camera? No, I don't think so at all. If the police can storm into your home, if they can control what you say, I wouldn't feel safer. I don't think that that's a straightforward equation at all. I think that freedom and freedom of speech keeps us safer. I genuinely believe that. As to whether the problem of women being in public office means that we're in the censorious situation that we are, look at who owns the big tech companies. No. Look at who were the first victims of online censorship. You know, the problem became crystal clear when it was about women and women's right to free speech.
Norman, did you want to say?
Yeah, I did. Because I think, Toby, I think you're completely 100% wrong. I think you're to some extent you're trivializing the discussion, because this is not about women or men. Censoriousness, safety, risk aversion is not something that is gender specific. It is cuts across the whole culture that we're currently engaged in. And the driver of this is not gender based. It is what I tried to outline, but I don't think explained particularly well given the time I had. But the point about this is that what underlies this uncertainty or this desire to control speech is uncertainty amongst the elite themselves. The elite is what is the problem here. And I include big tech in this because they are very much a part of it. But they are not the only perpetrators. And I have sympathy with what Thomas is saying about the algorithms and everything. I mean, to be honest, I haven't found bias for pro-Palestinian material in the last few weeks. It's been pro-Israeli material that I've suffered from, that I haven't seen, that I've posted, that hasn't appeared. But the problem here, it goes much deeper than that. The problem is this, that if you just think for a minute, hate speech, disinformation, these categories that we're using, the only way you can counter this is not by having algorithmic transparency or whatever. What we need in response to hate speech is more speech, is free speech. We want the anti-Semites to be able to publish what they say. We want the people that think that a woman can have a penis to publish online. We don't want to curtail that, because it's only in the realm of public opinion that you can actually establish what the truth actually is. That's why I asked the question, who decides? And it's the elites that are deciding this, because it's them who are using these platforms as a means through which they are beginning to cohere their own understanding of society. That's what I don't think people really understand. And it's particularly why, when they hear a voice which is contrary to theirs, they will censor it, because they are so uncertain of their own values. You only censor when you are uncertain, when you don't want other views because you feel that those views will be ones that people will just take up. And their contempt of social media is the social. It's the ordinary people. They think ordinary people are thick, gullible, racist, etc., who don't know what their real interests are. But they, the elite, the technocrats, the experts, the managers, they know what's good for us. And anybody who says anything contrary to that is going to get censored. It's as simple and as difficult and as complex as that. This is a real crisis of authority. It's not a trivial issue, this at all. This gets to the very heart of democracy, to the pillars of democracy. And unless we are unequivocal that the only way you can fight this is to be 100% for free speech, even for people, especially for people that you disagree with, that you hate even, They have got to have the right to say what they can say in order for those ideas to come out into the public realm where they can be dealt with, where they can be debated, where truth can be established, not told to us by our betters what is right and what is wrong.
Just Norman, I think there's a lot in your analysis that one of the reasons our masters are so keen to suppress dissent is because they're not very confident of their own values, their own philosophical outlook. They don't want to be put on the spot and forced to defend it because they haven't thought very deeply about how to defend it. It's sort of paper thin. It's a castle built in the air. So perhaps counterintuitively, does that mean one way to try and talk them down from the ledge and make them a little less censorious, a little more open to challenge and debate, help them flesh out their own philosophy, reach out to the woke and say, look, we know that you're not very confident because you haven't thought very deeply about these various values. We want to help you think them through, not in an aggressive way, just to help you flesh them out a bit. So when you are challenged in the public square, your first impulse is not to silence the challenger, but to engage in debate. We want to give you the tools to enable you to do that. Do you want to quickly come back on that, Constantine?
Well, I was about to defend you on the woman stuff, but on this, I actually think you're wrong. I think we should, by the way, on the woman stuff, I think it's ridiculous to say you are completely wrong. Men and women are different, and the entry of women into politics does change the values of how we do things. And it's not just women. Men's testosterone levels are dropping massively with every generation. So both men and women are having an impact on this. But so I just wanted to say that. But on this, I think it is a complete failure of imagination and empathy on our part to imagine that Mark Zuckerberg is sitting there being woke. You have to imagine this from his perspective. He started this thing on the internet in his bedroom at wherever university he was. And then he's wearing a hoodie, and fast forward 10 years, people are creating what some people are telling him, authoritative people, is an insurrection to overthrow the American government on the app that he created in his bedroom. Can you imagine the level of terror he would feel at that situation? The reason they're doing this is they're attempting to keep us safe. And we have to win the argument that them doing this is not making the world safer, and that we need to maintain a level of freedom that is commensurate with Western values. And until we're willing to assert that, we're never, ever going to win this argument on the basis that we're proposing here.
Okay.
Can I just say something very briefly?
One person again.
Then we really will come out to the audience.
I think boiling it down just to a question of freedom versus safety, I think risks simplifying the argument a bit too much. And I think it might risk being counterproductive because, of course, there's a pathological obsession with safety, as we saw during the pandemic and as we see in online censorship as well. But there's also a healthy concern for safety. As you said, the internet is a dangerous place. Parents out there probably have concerns about what their kids do when they are online. So there is an understanding that the internet is a dangerous place. And so I think simply if we make the argument into one of ultra-libertarianism, deregulation, let everyone do and say what they want online, versus the censors and the hyper-regulationists, then I think that's a losing battle. I think some level of regulation is inevitable. And I would say is necessary. And we all agree that some stuff should be censored online. We all agree that child porn should be censored online, and that's clearly illegal. But it's the border between what's speech and what's not speech is not that clear cut. When it comes to videos, especially, how much violence is acceptable? Not necessarily illegal stuff, not child porn, but how much violence is acceptable on social media. And I could go on. And I think a lot of people are rightly concerned about social media. And so I think the question has to be not whether we want regulation or whether we don't want it, but it has to be, as even Norman said, who decides, who regulates? This has to be the discussion, I think, because, imagining a world where no one decides is not only one that most people would not want, but it's a practical impossibility. Someone is always deciding. And so the question is, who decides? Based on what terms, and how accountable they are, and how democratic is the process. I think that's the discussion we should be having.
Okay, so let's go out to you.
Underlying a lot of what you were saying, almost everything that I agree with, by the way, is a notion that I'm not sure is apparent, which is that social media is, for lack of a better word, a public square. And I'm not sure that's the case because, and I'll give you as a challenge, the Alex Jones case, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where he, for months, claimed on social media, including YouTube, that the Sandy Hook was a hoax, and as a result, the parents of the murdered children have been harassed endlessly. Now, YouTube made the decision, or Google made the decision to basically remove him from their platform, even though he hasn't actually broken any specific laws. He hasn't caused for incitement to violence or anything like that. So I guess my question is to you, if you consider social media as a form of public square, then the other side of the coin suddenly becomes, should the government or whoever have the right to say to entrepreneurs who create social media who they are allowed to keep there and who they are not allowed to ban? Thank you.
Just, I wanted to know, I've had
Please
a
don't
couple
mind.
of things that I've seen today. One of them, someone suggested that maybe politicians should not be allowed to have Twitter accounts. Maybe they would be allowed to debate more freely and speak more freely what their minds are and what they really think, rather than tweeting to their crowds on Twitter. In terms of, especially the trans debate and all the crazy things that they come out with. Wouldn't it be better if they were actually debating policy and not actually playing to a crowd, as so many of them do on Twitter?
I would agree with Silky that framing the debate as a conflict between freedom and safety is obviously misconceived. The real issue is that restricting freedom and censorship is inherently unsafe and is about the most unsafe thing you can allow a government ever to do. And there is a fundamental problem with a constitution that ever allows any government ever to have or ever to acquire the power to control what people may say. What is required is radical, fundamental constitutional reform, irreversibly to take away that power from the state and irreversibly to take away the state's power ever getting that power again.
Toby has said that in relation to disinformation, the big tech companies are going to act according to the Digital Services Act of the EU, rather than according to the Online Safety Act. So therefore, this is going to be determined on an EU level. My question is, European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10, is a statement about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Have there been any cases taken to the European Court of Justice against acts of the big tech companies in relation to disinformation on the basis of Article 10?
Good. Okay. So should we start with you, Konstantin? Because you seem to be defending the idea that there is a trade-off between free speech and safety. And several people have challenged you, Silky, a challenge from the floor, that actually restricting speech, for the most part, does not make people safer, not least because you can't trust the people restricting speech to do it with a view to defending public safety.
Well, quite, but we redefined what I meant by safety. The reason that the Labour MP I mentioned on Question Time said that you get more safety, and she said we need the safest internet in the world, is not that she wants to put people in North Korea. It's because she wants to have an internet where people are not exposed to the wrong type of content, violent content, suicide content, etc., etc. So we've played around with the issue of safety to make me look bad, which I'm very happy with. But to your point, so in the brown coat, I actually think what I'm trying to say to everybody here is that there is a difference between being morally right, which I believe you are, and winning the argument with people who do not share your worldview. The people who are censoring the internet do not share your worldview that more freedom of speech creates more safety. They do not believe that. In fact, they believe the opposite. And given that, as Thomas said, we are arguing about where the line is, we all believe child porn should be censored on the internet. We all believe other forms of quote unquote speech should be censored on the internet. For example, there was a guy with like 1.5 million Twitter followers who I quote tweeted the other day, who posted a video of apparently American soldiers disembarking from a cargo plane in Israel to go and fight. except it was a video from 2002 and American soldiers landing in Romania. Now, whether that should be censored or not is a separate conversation, but I think all of us would agree that is not a helpful form of speech that we all want to encourage. We would want to discourage that, whether community notes or some kind of Uber-style rating system is the way we do it or whatever. So that's part of it. Another part of it where I think what you're saying is morally right, and I agree with you, but impractical is you're basically saying we should have a First Amendment in the UK. I agree with you. It's never, ever, ever, ever going to happen. It's not going to happen. The vast majority of the people of this country don't support that. It's never going to be electorally viable. It's never going to happen. And we should stop pretending that it is.
Okay. Thomas.
One person.
Most people agree that free speech absolutism is a very difficult position to defend, as commonly understood. There needs to be some censorship of some speech by the law, child porn being a really good example. But do you think that Alex Jones would fall into that category? Should him accusing the parents of children killed in mass shootings of being crisis actors and causing them a great deal of pain and suffering as a consequence, should that be legally permitted? And if it is legally permitted, are there other extra legal ways that he should be censored? Should content moderators on social media platforms ban him? I mean, with a kind of more difficult issue like that, like InfoWars, what would be the correct, most appropriate response, do you think?
Well, I think we have existing legal avenues to settle these issues. I mean, clearly there was a case was brought against Alex Jones that, he was, he was, I think we already have, institutions and avenues to address issues where, real actual harm is claimed to have been done to someone, even just, through speech. I think it's totally unacceptable that anyone decides, outside of the courts to censor, whether it be Alex Jones or whether it be Russell Brand or anyone else. I think it's the extrajudiciary aspect of it all that is terrifying. It's the fact that there are no rules. It's completely lawless. I think that's the really terrifying part. As I said earlier, someone is deciding, but we have no say over those decisions, over how those decisions are made, and there are no ways to appeal those decisions. So it's how do we bring all that within a legal judiciary framework where someone can bring a case against someone saying that person did serious harm to me, for example, by doxing me, which is when you publish someone's address online. I think there's a good case to be made that stuff should be. If not, clearly you should be able to bring a legal case against someone for doing that. But it shouldn't just be up to the platforms to autonomously decide what can be said and what cannot be said. I think that's the fundamental problem. We have to create a legal architecture, a regulatory architecture for addressing these issues. I think that's the only way to get around it. Otherwise, people are going to continue deciding over these issues, but it's not going to be us.
Okay. So a gentleman on the floor, Silky, said that one way to constrain the new regulators and regulatory apparatus created by the Digital Services Act and the Online Safety Act would be to bring a case in the European Court on Article 10 grounds. How much scope do you think there is for that? Do you think anything in the Digital Services Act or the Online Safety Act is challengeable under Article 10, or regulatory overreach in due course will be challengeable? And are you gearing up to do that?
Yes, potentially, but because of the way in which the laws are constructed, as Norman set out, whereby it's the law says to the tech companies, you better do something about all the nasty stuff online, and then the tech companies do it, and they get punished if they don't do enough of it, but it is defined by the tech companies. Sorry, this is so clunky to describe it. It's just the way that it is. It's much more difficult to challenge than if governments were simply ordering certain types of censorship. And will any human rights groups take this kind of challenge? I don't know, except for us. In terms of we are currently gearing up for the first legal challenge in Europe with regards to the UK counter-disinformation unit. And we're in the very early stages, but we will look to do that on Article 10 grounds, on the basis that this so-called counter-disinformation unit that is responsible for flagging lawful speech to tech companies to be censored, the whole way that they're operating. Let's not forget, Article 10, this is why the Human Rights Act matters so much. It's the starting point for this whole discussion. And I know there are a lot of people that want to see the Human Rights Act gone, but don't overlook how important that is. When you think about the right to free speech you have online, on the streets, at work, wherever it is, Article 10 is the premise by which the government has a duty to protect your freedom of speech. It's really, really important, and we think that they failed in that duty. So hopefully we will be able to pursue some legal action on that front. We've got a crowdfunder actually going at the moment. So if you go to minitruth.co.uk, you can find out more about that legal action. Can I come back to something Constantine said,
Sure.
please? On freedom and safety. I see where you're coming from, but the premise, and I agree that right now in the current context, trying to convince a lot of people that more freedom of speech makes you more safe, that's probably not where obviously that's not a view that's held by the censorious section of society. I was going to say the left, but sorry, I'm not partisan. Sorry, I have to say I'm not partisan. But we've all seen the trend. But it used to be because how did we get gay rights, women's rights, race equality? The left were champions of freedom of speech on those bases. Let's not forget that the change that's happened and that change in perspective is very, very recent. So we shouldn't just surrender to it. We should still challenge it.
Toby, may I very
Yep.
quickly? I agree with you on all that. I think you're right, especially about the left. As someone who used to be on it, I think the point I would make to you is when these people, and you know this probably better than I do because you talk to them more than I do, when these people talk about safety, what they mean is, well, if we allow people to speak freely online, then what they're going to do is post videos encouraging people to commit suicide. Really, you can't be for that, can you, Silky? Surely. And on it goes. So it's not that they've misunderstood the argument. I think the landscape's changed. Social media is a nuclear weapon of communication, and the real world impacts of that change how we think about these issues. That's, I think, the point I'm trying to make. So I actually think we agree on quite a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
Okay. Let's have some more questions from the floor.
Freedom of speech. It depends on who's going to make a decision as to what is allowed and what is not allowed. Could imagine that people in North Korea, China, or whatever it is, they had the same kind of panel. We're trying to figure out where do we draw the line. What do we allow people to say? What do we allow people to think and not to think? And I think that's where the danger starts. I believe in total freedom of speech because it's always, even before the internet, there were people who had funny views, and there will always be that. Now they've got another medium to express. We are so weak in our arguments that we don't feel we can handle it, and we've got to silence it. And that's the thin end of the wedge of our problem. Then weak totalitarian regime or thinks that they are right and everything starts to kind of push their way. And I'll tell you what, years ago, Norman organizations were labeled as terrorists. Somebody labeled them as terrorists because they didn't like them. Britain or the States did that. So when they labeled 77 for Irish people, Irish, the labeled racist. When the Mau Mau were, fighting for freedom, labeled as terrorists. South Africa, the ANC was labeled racist. Every time they action and they hurt people, or white people in South Africa, but there was a whole deluge of people who came out and dumped on the ANC and justified violence on black people or on Irish people, etc. And we got the same thing going on in Palestine at present. And try and think. I mean, I stopped listening to BBC, but for the opposite reason.
Yeah, do you have a question, sir?
Thank you. That's very kind. Thanks, man. Okay.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. So I would like to ask Norman, when the last time he heard BBC, somebody answer this question, right? Because they always say, oh, Hamas, it's like almost like the Israeli government just sent out this thing, that the mantra that the Hamas terrorist organization kill women all the time, right? And but nobody's ever asked, and oh, therefore Israel has a right to self-determination, and therefore they can do anything. Right? X number of babies killed here, 100 times more is killed on the other side, but that doesn't matter. Right? So the question they were never asked is, do the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination? Now, Norman and I believe.
I think that's slightly off topic, if I may say
No,
so. But I think we can frame it another way. We can say, thank you, sir. Thank you.
I'll put it as a question.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I think we can frame it. I'll frame it another way, so we don't just get into a totally different issue. Let me ask the room briefly. Hands up who thinks that explicitly supporting Hamas on today's protest should be a criminal offence, and perhaps it might even be a criminal offence, and that the police should arrest those people. Anyone in the room think that anyone explicitly supporting Hamas on today's protest should be arrested? What about crime? What about chanting jihad? The river to the sea? Okay, so that's interesting. There does seem to be not a majority, but a minority of you who don't think that it should be acceptable to say those things in the public square. Let's have another question.
This might be a naive question, but I wonder, I have a slight background in broadcasting, and I heard that Ofcom were going to start getting involved in censoring the internet. Lots of people were very upset by that, but I have had dealings with Ofcom, quite reasonable. Pleased to hear lots of men. Yeah. So there's something about content creation on the internet, which is a little bit difficult, because you don't really have access to a set of guidelines, and you can't negotiate with anyone. Whereas in broadcasting, you could bring up Ofcom, challenge the decision. Might be a good thing. Well, I wouldn't.
I've got a question about the internet, and it's based on what Konstantin said about safety. Because my point would be, we aren't less safe. We are more safe. We are more safe than we have ever been in human history. There is less crime. There is less racist violence. There's less hate. Safety is a ideological idea that's being wielded as a means of social control, as part of the much more profound change in our political structures and political elites. And that's why we've got woke, and that's why we've got this confusion between what was left and what was right, and how left-wing ideas now seem more right-wing and right-wing ideas now seem more left-wing. We're going through a massive realignment. And I would say that the internet social media is an amplification of that. So my question is, Konstantin said that social media was a nuclear weapon. Is social media a nuclear weapon?
So I'm sure we all, I suppose anyway, agree that the state generally should protect free speech, but also that free speech is not necessarily an entitlement to be given a platform. And in civil society, we want culture of tolerance, absolutely, but the state is a completely different category. And so my question to the panel is it wise or even appropriate to increase the power and the scope of the state by asking it to enforce an entitlement to be given a platform?
Okay, I'll start with Norman, and then we'll go to you.
Right. Well, I think there's some very important questions being asked. I do agree with this point about safety, though. Have we all become children? I mean, is it the case that we need somebody to keep us safe, that we can't discern what's dangerous and what isn't, that we don't have the moral capability of discerning what's good and what's evil? Come on, people. I mean, this is just ridiculous that we're having this discussion. I think what we need to do is go back to basic first principles, which is this: that freedom of speech should be freedom of speech. There should be no ifs and buts. I think there's a distinction, for example, what Toby raised, between people walking on the streets of London shouting from the river to the sea versus somebody in that crowd pointing at a Jew and saying, let's get the Jew. The one is incitement to violence. The other is the exercise of free speech.
What about calling for jihad? Is that the same?
Jihad, I think, is the same thing in the sense of saying it as, well, you know, according to the Metropolitan Police, there's many different interpretations of what this is. Again, you know, the Hamas Broadcasting Corporation, the Metropolitan Police, who become these Islamic students, it's quite mealy-mouthed rubbish, frankly. I think it depends in the context, because if you're shouting jihad and you're inciting people to go and on a pogrom, then that is illegal. That is incitement to violence. But saying jihad in the streets of London in a kind of frenzy, it's of no consequence whatsoever. And we have
Jihad
to defend.
means holy
We have
war.
to defend. We have to defend the right of people to say what they think, to think the unthinkable, and to say what they think.
Sure.
Because that is the only way, ladies and gentlemen, not the human rights, the Court of Human Rights or whatever, which we will defend the right to establish the truth. And it's up to us as the public, not our rulers, not the courts, not the flaggers, not anybody else. It's up to us, because what these people are really saying to us, and this is what I would like the other panelists to address, is, yeah, we don't trust you. That's what they're really saying. And so our answer to that is not to say, well, we need to set up an inquiry, or we need this body, or we need that body. It's up to us to say, no, we can discern what the truth is. What you say is the truth is not necessarily my truth. Let's debate it. And the social media has become, unfortunately, the new public square. And for all the blemishes that it has, it also is very positive. It's also a remarkably powerful piece of technology that is enabling us to collaborate and to do things in a way that we've never done before. We should not be curtailing it. We should be demanding more freedom on the internet, not closing it down. And we should demand that not only from our rulers, but from big tech. The unelected Silicon Valley barons have got no more right to determine what should or shouldn't be said online. Just like our politicians, it is up to us. The onus is on us. This is all about us, not about them.
Okay, thanks, Norman. So let's come to you now, Constantine. It sounded like from your interventions then that you think the police should arrest protesters chanting jihad. Is that your position? Do you want to briefly?
Well, they're not misgendering anyone, so maybe not. But no, I mean, the call for jihad is a call to holy war and to slaughtering your enemies. So to pretend otherwise, I think, is disingenuous. If we believe in free speech, we should also believe in understanding. If we believe in free speech, we should also be honest about what words mean. Which brings me back to the gentleman's point in the middle. I mean, he was talking about how there've always been people around who, by the way, I find it strange finding myself on the side of arguing for certain restrictions of speech, but as someone who really believes in the importance of freedom of expression, but I think we also should not let ourselves run away in our own excitement from reality. There've always been people who had all kinds of crazy ideas, and those people were pub bores. If a pub bore said in a pub, I think 5G masks cause COVID, that didn't cause any consequences in the real world. What we saw during the pandemic was that when David Icke said 5G masks cause COVID, people went out and burned 5G masks. Pretending that doesn't happen doesn't help us win the free speech argument. It makes us look like idiots in the eyes of people who are dealing with the real world. But hold on a second, just one point. This is why Elon Musk, I never called myself a free speech absolutist for this very reason. When Elon Musk took over Twitter, he said, I'm a free speech absolutist. And then within minutes, he was censoring people that he felt were doing things he didn't like. Nobody in charge of anything is ever going to be a free speech absolutist because it's not possible. We have to argue about what the reasonable limits are. Otherwise, we just look crazy. And by the way, both the IRA and Hamas are terrorist groups.
Okay. Thomas, a woman made a very good point from the floor, which is that for all the panic about rising hate crime, and the persecution of beleaguered, historically disadvantaged groups, the suppressed and so forth, the oppressed, actually, most of the evidence suggests that there's never been less hatred of people because they're gay or because they have a different religious point of view and the rest of it. So how do you explain this, in particular, this elite panic about hatred when actually there's never been less hatred in the West, today notwithstanding?
I'd love to answer that, but I want to come back to the Hamas question.
Okay.
Because I feel that it's related to what I said at the beginning. I think we're not going to win this battle if we're not consistent in our commitment to free speech. And that means also standing up and defending opinions we disagree with. It should be obvious, and I thought it was obvious to most people in the free speech battle with whom I have shared those battles these past few years. But it seems that that's not exactly the case. And I have to say, in this sense, it has been slightly disappointing to see so many people who have stood up for free speech these past few years remain quite quiet about the numerous people that have been censored, suppressed, fired, not for saying Hamas is great, but simply for expressing solidarity with Palestine, with the Palestinians, or maybe even just for saying maybe carpet bombing children is not a great idea. And I know people that have been fired for simply tweeting, criticism of Israel's bombing of Gaza. And I would have, seen a slightly more fiery reaction from part of the free speech crowd would have been nice. And I think this is really problematic, I think. I mean, if we're not able, I come from the left, and these past few years, I've mostly shared these battles with people who come from the right because they were the ones who were targeted mostly. And that even brought me to defend people and opinions that maybe I didn't fully share. And frankly, it has been a bit disappointing. I think maybe a wider reflection on this would be necessary. I mean, if we turn the free speech issue into a partisan issue, I think we've already lost a battle. Yeah.
Okay. And finally, Silky, last word from you.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I won't take too much time, just to say thanks for having a conversation with us. I mean, it's a very, very important one. One theme that comes out of what people have said is that it seems that some of us are trying to act as though we have a tabula rasa situation, that we're at a starting point for working out free speech. That's ironically what the people working in the tech companies want you to think, because it enables them to sit around chin scratching going, what rules should we make this week? Let's start with the rule of law that we already have, with the human rights framework that we already have. These issues that we're talking about today have been thought through extensively over decades. The problem is that they're not being observed in the way that people currently can speak. So I think that's the right starting point. If the Online Safety Act said that the tech companies have to observe domestically the rule of law and the human rights framework and nothing else, things would be much better. It wouldn't have been controversial, and we'd be in a much better situation. So that's the starting point, and that's what we're campaigning for.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I just want to say, just before we thank our panelists, just wanted to say that if you do hear about anyone who has lost their job, been cancelled, been no platform because they've said something explicitly partisan about the Israel-Palestine conflict, whether pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, but nothing unlawful, then please do let us know, because the Free Speech Union will defend them. I think most of the examples we've come across have been in the United States. There haven't been, as far as I know, any really good cases here yet. But we'd certainly be happy to take up the cudgels on behalf of anyone who finds himself persecuted, penalised, if just merely for expressing support for one side or another in that conflict in a perfectly lawful way. Anyway, thank all of you for bearing with us for the past hour and a half, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel, Norman Lewis, Silky Carlo, Thomas Farsi, and Konstantin Kislyak. And if you haven't joined the Free Speech Union yet, what's keeping you?